So, what is the percentage chance that this jury convicts? That's a reasonable question. And between, we still don't know a lot of elements of this thing. So, if the prosecution runs this flawlessly and their witnesses are as good as I fear they might be, then and some of these witnesses we don't know yet because we haven't seen them. We haven't seen Aperture, we haven't seen, new medical examiner, we haven't seen, their dog bite. We don't know how these people will really perform. So I'm kind of assuming the worst possible case for these witnesses when I'm assessing this. It's like, what is the worst possible case? And it's like, okay, it's like 60% to convict. And you could very reasonably criticize me for any number of reasons. I think that unfortunately, I think it's true that a lot of juries work on feels and vibes and zeitgeist and sort of overall impressions, and I feel like they back end logic into the emotional thing. And so I think that, and I also think that juries eat up confessions. And I think that there's a really strong possibility that, there were three or four or five witnesses who said, I heard her say I hit him. Now, you can criticize all five of those witnesses easily on the facts, right? None of them put it in their reports to the extent they testified, at grand juries. They didn't tell the grand jury about it, right? These are all sort of late discovery things. But I think that, even though you can criticize all five very reasonably, and like, even if she said it, right, which is another point beyond it, it's like, even if she said it, everyone sort of agrees that she was hysterical. And like, when people are hysterical, they say all kinds of things without even knowing what they're saying. I've slipped up saying things on stream. I stream a lot without being hysterical. Sometimes I have a slip of the tongue or I misstate something, or it's like I didn't state something perfectly. And I'm not hysterical, but when you stream enough, you're going to say things that are just not quite correct. And so the fact that even assuming that she said it, you could very easily discount that she said it in a state of hysteria, and therefore she might not have even known what she was saying. That's a very reasonable thing to think too. So, like, she didn't say it at all, or at least the witnesses saying she said it are not credible. There's differences between their other testimony. They've changed their story to some degree. They didn't put it in their initial reports. They didn't testify about it in an earlier grand jury. None of the police say they heard it, or in their reports. There's lots of ways to criticize that as not being credible evidence. My sort of concern is that the jury is going to sort of say, well, three or four or five people have said it. They can't all be lying. And that's going to kind of be where that analysis stops. And that's that. And I think that is a non-trivial concern. And the Innocence Project, among other people, will be happy to tell you about how people falsely confess and juries believe those confessions, up to and including contradictions with physical evidence. That when a jury thinks there's a confession, they eat that shit up, because every juror apparently is under some collective delusion that they would never say the incriminating thing. If it were them, they would never say the incriminating thing, even though they totally would. They 100% would. But juries are under some sort of collective delusion that they would never say the incriminating thing. They would never say anything that like could possibly be used to, say that they did. They surely never me. It must be she has a guilty mind. Juries unfortunately can eat that shit up. Not that they do every single time, but there are enough cases where they have eaten it up that I think it's a note of significant caution. So I think that there's a unfortunately strong probability that the jury says, well, I heard three or four or five people say it, and they can't all be mistaken. They can't all be lying. They might be not precisely correct about exactly how and when they heard it, but she said it, right? And I think that that's a very realistic possibility. And I think that if they believe that to be a confession, putting aside that you can blame it on hysteria, but if they believe it to be a confession, that gets you a long way towards some kind of conviction. And then, so that's like one element of the state's case. And then the other element of the state's case, which we don't really have yet, is the physics, right? Because we haven't heard from Aperture. We haven't heard from Aperture in terms of their physical reconstruction or their reconstruction experts. So, if you know, if the prosecution has a new ME that can really like sing a song, and they have, they have some people that can really, let's say, go toe to toe with with Arca. If they have some people that at least seem like they're as credible as Arca, and they have some people that can, perhaps blind them with science, right? If the Aperture stuff winds up being a wash with Arca, and they have their new ME and some sort of dog behavioral expert and blah blah blah, like that becomes the second leg of their case, right? So if all that kind of stuff that I just mentioned, if that's late in this Cade in Chief, or possibly even shifted completely into the rebuttal case, which I think is what I would do at this point if I were the prosecution. I think at this point I would take all those witnesses and shift them completely into the rebuttal case. I think that would probably be the strategically wise thing to do, because I want to make sure that I have a good rebuttal case, because it's the last thing the jury is going to hear. So I want my best stuff to be in the rebuttal case. I have enough now to not be dismissed. I am quite positive the judge is going to dismiss. They probably should have dismissed after the end of the state's case the first time around, but this time I think is going a lot better for them. And so I think even a fair-minded judge would be hard pressed to dismiss or grant a directed verdict at the end of this state's case. Judges don't like to intervene for all kinds of reasons. So even a fair-minded judge would be difficult to intervene. So, you know, we're in the shit sandwich portion of the case. We're in the everything kind of sucks portion of the case with Buchanan and you know the state labs and other things. We're in the yeah, part of the case. So I think at this point, if I were the state, I think I'd shift app if I wasn't already doing it. I'd shift Aperture, any rebuttal medical expert, probably the dog bite guy. I'd shift that into my rebuttal case, and try to end strong. And then between my closing argument as the prosecutor and my rebuttal close of the argument, those would be my twin pillars, right? That would be my twin pillars. One of it, which one is which, I don't think really matters. Take your pick. Either the initial close is the you know it take because you've got two things. The confession is one of the things, the physics is the other thing. So you take one of those things, it's your initial close. The rebuttal close is the other thing. And which one do you think is more powerful, or more powerful emotionally? Probably is the way to do that. So probably the right answer, although again, it's something I'd have to think about more thoroughly if I were doing it for real. But probably the right answer, I think, is your initial closing as the state is your physics stuff. Anything like objective, let's say, anything objective relating to medical, relating to um, science, relating to Aperture, I think is your initial close. Then your rebuttal close becomes the confession, because that's the stronger emotional point, right? And she's you sell them on you sell them no reason that no person would say these things unless they're true. No person would say these things unless they were admissions from their soul. You really kind of sell that, and you're a long way towards a conviction, at least in my mind. And you do need all 12 to agree, of course. It is beyond a reasonable doubt, at least in principle. And if some jurors might not be willing to convict because of the many 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 problems with the case we could spend time on. But I think the possibility of a conviction, particularly relating to some sort of compromise verdict on the manslaughter, is particularly plausible. And part of that equation, of course, part of the factor of my 60% conclusion is I thought the case was a complete, absolute trash fire last time around. And apparently 6 to 8 members of the jury were ready to convict on that bullshit. And the state's case is going better than it was the first time. So if 6 to 8 members of a jury were ready to convict on that bullshit, surely the probability that 12 members would be ready to convict on some version of manslaughter as a compromise verdict, so they all get to go home, you know, do justice, blah blah blah, you know, I think is a very high plausibility.